Dark Souls 2 can certainly be a good-looking game when it wants to. However, Dark Souls 2, I mentioned the difficulty was done a lot by copying and pasting, because Dark Souls 2 and Dark Souls going forward from 1, and this is part of why I like 1, is that going forward from 1, because 1 was never marketed as hard, per se. Obviously, there's the Prepare to Die edition, but that's effectively the PC release. That's not... Many people weren't buying it with the Prepare to Die edition moniker. Whereas with Dark Souls 2, there was sales directly, and there was marketing directly around the idea that this game is hard. And something that adds to that is this. There is a worldwide death counter in this game. So Dark Souls 2 sells itself on being hard, as does Dark Souls 3 to an extent. Because hard is mimetic. Especially the Dark Souls brand of quote-unquote hard is very mimetic. I mean, look at the trend that I am particularly loathsome of, which is the X is the Dark Souls of Y. Crash Bandicoot was the Dark Souls of 3D platformers, Cuphead was Dark Souls but 2D. I loathe this trend, because Dark Souls 1 in particular was not necessarily hard. Dark Souls 1 is very much a callback to the ideas of, say, sort of Zelda 1, old NES style of game design, where the player is not necessarily told what to do. The player is given a number of ways forward and has to find their own way. Or make their own way. And while I am a fan of that game design from time to time, it certainly has its own weaknesses. Because you see, when you have games of that sort of design style, Zelda 1, Dark Souls 1, etc., you inherently reach a point where the game is only so difficult as the player is unaware of what is in it and where. Certainly if you look at everyone who has played Dark Souls and is a fan, they will agree, unless they do some insane challenge run, that the most difficult playthrough and the longest playthrough of any Dark Souls game is their first playthrough. This is because the player doesn't know where things are and when. They don't know how to find certain weapons that they like to use. They don't know how to find they don't know how to find healing items, etc. And it's very much the same in the first Zelda game. And so in this way, the player is given the tools to explore the open world and to power up before ever going into the dungeon. However, this all comes down to if you know how to get bombs, which is either by going into a few of the guaranteed spawn locations and killing enemies, or by knowing how enemy drops work in Zelda 1, which is that in Zelda 1, as you kill enemies, it's on a counter. But again, I'm digressing. Dark Souls 1 follows the same formula, although instead of the abstract item keys, you definitely have a lot of keys in terms of opening areas. And one of the ways that Dark Souls 1 also differs is that it likes to form natural shortcuts as opposed to natural barriers. So, perhaps the foremost example of this, the example that people will always see their first playthrough, and that's when they'll sort of start to understand what the game is doing, is the connection of Firelink Shrine in the Undead Parish, where when you take the elevator down, you link back up to Firelink Shrine, and suddenly the world starts to connect in on itself, and the player has developed a new shortcut and a new, faster way to grind enemies and level up, as well as potentially upgrading their weapons. And so Dark Souls is, in that way, they form these natural shortcuts instead of you need bombs to get through here. And as a result of that, when you know where these shortcuts are, and as well when you know which bosses are optional, Dark Souls gets faster. Like how if you know that you can get into Blight Town and the Daughters of Chaos area through the Valley of Drakes, it skips going through the depths. Although there are many helpful things in the depths, you never need to play through the depths. As well, knowing that you can go and kill Ceaseless Discharge and get several embers early, will give the player the power to earlier gear, and the fact that they can also then farm in the Daughters of Chaos area, so long as they're willing to fight what are going to, at that point in the game, be relatively tough enemies in the Tauros and Capra Demon. So with Dark Souls in your first playthrough, you will not necessarily know about these things unless you're consulting a walkthrough or someone's leading you through the game. So if you want to, say, grind, as opposed to going to kill the Capra and Tauros demons in the Demon Ruins, you'll most likely grind the area that is most comfortable for you to be in at that stage in the game. Which is definitely lower risk, but it's going to give you a lower reward of souls. And this as well ties into the notion that Dark Souls is also shortened by your skill as well. Similar to the idea that NES games weren't necessarily that long, so they added difficulty to lengthen them. I don't think Dark Souls is actually a culprit of that. I think Dark Souls has a good amount of content, certainly enough that I can't complain. However, how much time is relatively added by deaths. So ultimately, Dark Souls 1 is not necessarily meant to be hard. It's certainly meant to be a challenge, but it's not meant to be, no, mate, we put fucking 700 enemies in the fucking area, and the player's gonna be bombarded by fucking firebombs. And if they run around, they can aggro these guys on the green. And what the fuck is this voice? You can aggro like 800 of them. It's gonna be so fucking hard. They're gonna be fucking dying 73 times in a row. This voice has changed accents like 19 times. But anyway, yeah. And Dark Souls 2, the base game, is not the biggest culprit of this, but Scholar of the First Sin absolutely is. And it's only added onto by the added NPC invasions that you'll see a lot in Dark Souls 2. Now, PvP in Dark Souls will always be an acquired taste. There are people who are big fans of it, and I enjoy it. However, most people would not in their right mind call it a well-executed and good system. It is at best flawed and enjoyable. And one of the reasons for this is that the invader in this equation is always going to be an advantage unless they're a madman. Because the invader is specifically looking to invade people, so they will realistically be prepared for an invasion. They will have builds for it. They can't lose souls and humanity for it. So the invader is then at this advantage where they are incentivized to invade because they stand to gain and not to lose, and so they will be built more for invasions, whereas the player is most of the time, unless they're seeking invasions and they're seeking PvP, they're simply trying to get to an area. And they will be built more around PvE, they will be less prepared, and they stand to lose because if you die to an invader, you still lose souls. And this is absolutely the case, but more so in Dark Souls 2 with the NPC invasions. The NPC invasions aren't so much twinks. I mean, they're not... It's not like... Because an invader in Dark Souls 1 or 3 or any of these games where it's a human invader, they're going to realistically be within a certain level of experience, whether this is by soul memory or soul level, and obviously there's twinking within those bounds, and there's ways to completely ruin the experience for other people, but they're still going to be relatively, and big emphasis on relatively, don't jump down my throat here talking about Dark Bead twinks in the remaster, they're going to be relatively within the area of where your build is. And that is just not the case in this. Enemies in Dark Souls 2 will, at least the invading NPCs, will often have access to gear that is far beyond what you have and spells that is far beyond what you have. And this includes healing spells, it's not just weapons. Offensive and healing spells will usually be so far beyond what the player has that the player effectively has to treat each encounter as stun-lock them until they die. Which is something that is in every Dark Souls game, absolutely, but it's best when it's minimized, I would say. I'm never going to claim that Dark Souls 1 doesn't have a lot of enemy encounters where the best course of action is to stun-lock them until they die. That is absolutely not the case. Dark Souls 1 has a lot of it. However, Dark Souls 2 it comes across more pronounced because Dark Souls 2, just sort of as an entirety, has a lot more enemies and throws a lot more enemies at you. Dark Souls 2 gets a lot of its difficulty from spam. Look at that room there, and count how many enemies there were in it. And Dark Souls 1 has enemies and areas with spam, but any area in Dark Souls 2 that is meant to be difficult is almost certainly going to build itself around these spam encounters. That or an ambush. And ambushes, at the very least, they're a bit more interactive than spam encounters, because spam, in almost every case, will just devolve into get them into a choke point, as I did, and whittle them off one by one, as I did. Whereas with an ambush, there are certain events where the ambush is based around the environment. The ambush is... Where the fuck did you come from? The ambush is based around environmental hazards. The ambush is based around the player being at a vulnerable point, such as having gotten out of a boss fight. And so at the very least, there's a bit more interesting that you can do with ambushes than with spam. Because with spam, it's ultimately just going to be there are a lot of enemies. And yeah, you can do there are a lot of enemies and there are environmental hazards. But the counterplay for spam, in that regard, will almost always devolve into the find a choke point and pick them off. Whereas the counterplay for an ambush in that regard is a little different. I'm not saying it's entirely different, but it's relatively. You got to speak in relatives here. You got to pretend your family get together. You're speaking in relatives. Wait, in? Don't think about that too much. Sometimes you speak without thinking. That's an example of an ambush. It's also an example of a not well done ambush. Putting one enemy behind or around a corner who will probably hit you before you hit them is not necessarily a well done ambush. I mean, it certainly creates a hostile work environment. What the fuck is that? However, it's not a particularly engaging enemy encounter. And engaging is subjective, you know. But what exactly is the challenge in taking chip damage from an enemy you can't see, other than when you come here a second time, you'll know about him? Sure, if you're trying to make the case that Dark Souls 2 is teaching you to memorize this area, that's fine. But then in that case, how are you supposed to lure this guy out? I mean, you can go in there, up this ramp, but then you're surrounding yourself with... Okay, guy. Then you're surrounding yourself with at least 3 enemies, and you're just giving yourself a horde to fight out of. It looks like an orc. Huh? So anyway, have I shit on Dark Souls 2 enough? And keep in mind that Dark Souls 2, I will call it the worst of the Soulsborne games. And I will call it not that great. I would still say this is far from bad in the strictest sense. And it's sort of one of those cases where even the worst Souls game is kind of ranked higher in my mind than a lot of mediocre other genres. It's just aggravating that this one is how it is, because I think there is a lot good in this that I would like to see improved on and I think you're fucking funny? I would like to see improved on and worked on in the future. I also think that this has some of the most interesting ideas of all of the Soulsborne games, but here's where we're getting into the subjective versus the objective, and seeing the forest versus the tree for the trees, and so on and so forth. I have a tendency at times to ignore some more legitimate problems with games because I think that something that they do is particularly cool, or that it's super unique. And this is super pronounced with games like Other M, where I think people give Other M more shit than it maybe deserves. And there are some bad things about Other M, but I also think that some of the complaints people have about it is semi-made up. Like, for example, I don't want to go on a big Other M tangent, because there will be a time and a place for that, but people complain that Other M ruined Samus's character. Which, I mean, I can sort of understand that complaint, but I also think that that complaint is ultimately, it's arguing from a place of feeling more than it is Samus's actual character. Because simply, my response would be, what character? You look at the best games in the Metroid series, and as well, you just sort of look at all the games in the Metroid series, because there haven't been that much, and tell me, please, what is Samus's actual character? Because the one that has the most character is Fusion, realistically. I don't know, I have only played most of Zero Mission. I'm sure the text dump at the end does a lot to characterize. Whatever. But people will say Fusion. Fusion's the one where she has the most character. Alright, her character in Fusion, Action Girl. Is there much more to it than that? I mean, there's a little more. There is the scene where she is speaking to the AI named Adam, and she makes an emotional appeal towards Adam as the person, and the AI resonates with it. But how is that more of a character moment for Samus than it is for the fucking AI? Like, and then you look at Fusion, and Samus is Action Girl. And I mean, she's still... If your case is that Samus is no longer Action Girl, then absolutely, they have ruined Samus's character. But my argument would be that Action Girl is not a particularly good character by itself. Again, I acknowledge I haven't played 100% of Metroid. I haven't played every Metroid ever all the way through. So if there is something I am missing and it's not in the fucking novelization, let me know in the comments. Call me a stupid idiot. I welcome it. If I'm wrong, I want to know. I want to improve. But at the same time, I think if your case is simply that they ruined Samus's character because she is no longer an Action Girl, my argument is going to be that Action Girl is not a good character. It is a fine thing to build on, because there are good Action Girls, but that's because they have more character than Action Girl. Look at Ripley from Alien and Aliens. She could just be boring action woman. And in the first one, she kind of is. But in the first one, she's sort of realistically scared. And then in the second one, they give her a lot of character in that she has these elements of motherhood. She's both scarred by what she's seen, and she's smarter for it. So she's able to survive situations where the meathead jock Space Marine guys are getting mowed down. So you have character depth there that goes beyond Action Girl. She's allowed to be a badass while still having more character. And you know what? There's a Metroid game where Samus has that sort of same characterization as Ripley. It's called Other fucking M. And I'm not saying it's done well in Other M. There's some serious flaws in Other M with how it's done. However, I would say at least some of those are just sort of a lost in translation thing. And that happens with games, ones I like sometimes as well, like when people call Twilight Princess edgy. Fucking what? It's like we have this assumption that we talk about other worlds and spirits, we obviously have to mean dead people. It's not how it fucking works. It's like how Onis aren't demons in the traditional sense. Oh, I'm getting a Windows pop-up. It happens sometimes. Oh, that's a bad one. Come on. Don't kill me. Oh, good lord. Well. That was very stupid. Solo stuff is hard. Remind me to abuse Nick. I don't think I beat him enough. Alright, come here. You fucking dingleberry. You fucking dingleberry. You fucking dingleberry. You... Oh my god, I hate you so much. There we go. Okay. Was that so hard? I despise you. Anyway, should I go up here and fight the pursuer? The real question is, can I use the buckler? Because if I can't use the buckler, I don't think so. Ooh, I don't know. I'll be parrying with this. Well, he's easy to parry. Why not? Let's try it. Here's another spam example. Here. Fight this actual boss while also surrounded by 3 or 4 random mobs. It's a lot like the Royal Rat Vanguard, which is probably my choice for the worst fight in this game. No. No grab. There we go. The Pursuer is almost embarrassingly easy once you know how to fight him. Or at least once you have your parry times down for him. Oh, apparently I don't have them quite down. And there we go. Yes, once you know the parry timing for the Pursuer, he's a little embarrassing as a boss. However, that doesn't stop his health bar from being the big health bar. Playing fast and loose here. I really should play less risky when I'm trying to win a very dangerous fight. However, I do have a checkpoint, so I'm not going to lose too much progress if I get sent back to the bonfire here. Anyway. And, I will never defend the controls and gameplay of Other M is the thing. Like, that is something where I will universally agree with people on 100%. It's shit. I can't... Like, the worst complaints you hear about the controls and gameplay in Other M are pretty much the exact way that I feel. It plays like absolute garbage. However, the complaints about the story, I think, are a little less than honest in some cases. I don't know. Maybe I'll play that at some point with Nicholas, and I'll retroactively discover that it is indeed a flaming pile of shit, because I haven't played it in maybe... God, wasn't that 2012, 2013? I haven't played in close to 3 or 4 years. I played it sometime after it came out. I want to say shortly, but it's not that shortly. It was about a year. It was right as the Wii U was coming out. I was just clinging on to my Wii like, no, this console will be around forever. I love the motion control.